Move on to making the front of the bag now. So take your fancy webbing and cut an 8cm piece of this and then fold it in half. Attach your D-ring onto it. And then line that up with the centre front of your bag panel. So you should have a notch there at the centre. And then we're going to just stitch that in place. So I'll just stitch within the seam allowance there just to hold that in place. So next we will add the little strappy bits that we prepared earlier with the rectangle rings on them. So if you take your 10cm pieces of strapping that you had from before, and then you want to measure in 1.5 centimetres on either end. We're just going to angle this. Fold in half and just trace that angle. It does tend to fray a little bit, this polypropylene webbing. And then we want to put your rectangle ring on there. Thread it on so that the join is concealed. So you've got two pieces looking like this. So looking at your base panel as if it's a t-shirt, if it's a T-shape like this, you want to come in from these outer corners and measure in 4 centimetres. And you can make a mark or a snip if a mark won't show. And then take your little strappy bit that you've just made. And then we want to place that at the 4 centimetre mark, folded in half and angled so that the rectangular ring is pointing towards the outside. And then just clip that in place. Same on the other side. And then we're just going to stitch through on either side. So I've put my navy blue thread back on. I'm just going to stitch within the seam allowance, and I'm just using, I know I'm sewing on this leatherette now, but it's just fine to use a normal stitch and your universal needle, nothing fancy required. So you just want to stitch this in place on both sides. There we go. So next we want to attach these two together. So put your front piece there with your D-ring at the top, and then place your leatherette panel right sides down, and you should see that you've got two opposing curves here because the bag is shaped. That's fine. You just start off by matching at the sides and the centre front, and then bring these two curves together. I mean, this will kind of crease up a bit as you sew, but that's fine. Once it's all unfolded, it will sit flat. So we'll start off by matching up the centre fronts. This is why it's important that we've marked our centre front on all our pieces. then we can bring this round and match this up here. Same on the other side, and then just walk the remaining fabric together. Use clips as opposed to pins, I reckon, because you don't want to be pinning your leatherette. Or if you've only got pins, then just pin within the seam allowance. So you can see it's creating some creases here. That's fine. This line is nice and straight, or nice and together. It's slightly curved. So there's my seam, and if we now push this up, flatten that down, so I want all those seam allowances to be pointing down towards the bottom. And if you need to, if you want to, you can trim that seam allowance, or I can just cut a couple of notches into the more curved area to help it sit through. To release a bit of the tension on those curves. It's not a dramatic curve, so I'm not going to cut into it a lot. And I don't really want to trim that seam allowance away, because when I top stitch, I sort of want to be catching that because it will help it sit nicely. So I'm not going to trim away too much. So over to the ironing board. So I don't really want to be pressing too much onto the leatherette. I'll just go onto the reverse and not using too much heat, just pressing quite lightly, just to sort of train the seam allowances to point downwards. So with all the seam allowance pointing down, I'm now going to do a top stitch on my leatherette panel. So make sure that the thread that you're using is a good match for your leatherette. And then find a reference point. I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3.5 because I like nice long top stitches. And then I just want to make sure that I am catching that seam allowance underneath there. So I'm using the edge of my foot as a guide. Nice neat top stitch.